All right, ladies and gentlemen, so we're going to go ahead and talk about our third cycle in nature starting today. That is the carbon cycle. We've already talked about the water cycle as well as the oxygen cycle. And so we're now on to our third one out of four. So we're talking about carbon cycle today. Now, the water cycle, there's a pretty good chance that you were already familiar with that, at least to some extent, before we started learning about it this year. You may have learned about it in elementary school, or perhaps it was last year in sixth grade if you were at PCA. Um, so you know that it has a kind of some basic steps to it, but it can get a little complicated in places. Then the oxygen cycle, you may or may not have been familiar with that, but hopefully, as you saw in the oxygen cycle lessons, it's a pretty straightforward cycle. There's not a lot of different parts to it. The carbon cycle, I'm not sure if you've studied this before at all. It's a little more like the water cycle in that it does have some kind of branching off to it, so to speak. And yet, despite that, cycles, as we've talked about before, are just a series of events that are that's hard to say, regularly repeated in the same order. Doesn't mean it's always the exact same order, but it does mean there's a certain order to it where you can't maybe go backwards or you can't skip over some steps. Now the question is, why is the carbon cycle so important? Well, it's important because carbon is found in so many different things that have to do with life. So carbon is found in proteins, it's found in sugars, it's found in fats, it's found in DNA. And all of these things are a part of almost every form of life. And so without these substances, or without carbon, which is a part of these substances, life would not be able to exist as it does today on Earth. So if these things are so important to living organisms, then where do they get the carbon from? Well, a lot of organisms, such as ourselves, we get carbon from food. So the food that we eat has carbon. That is because plants have carbon in them. We'll talk in just a moment why that is. And so when primary consumers eat plants, they're taking in carbon from the plant that they eat. When a secondary consumer eats a primary consumer, they're taking in some of the carbon from the plant that that primary consumer ate. So we get our carbon from food. However, there are some organisms that get their carbon from other things, like the atmosphere or water. For example, well, plants get their carbon from the atmosphere, or at least part of it. At least some of their carbon comes from the atmosphere. So they take in carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide has carbon in it. They take in the gas carbon dioxide and they use that gas in the process of photosynthesis to form oxygen and sugars. They then use some of that sugar as food and go through a process that we call cellular respiration, which animals and humans do as well, where we then use the oxygen and sugars from our food and to do cellular processes, and at the end of that there's kind of leftovers or waste products, carbon dioxide being one, and so we then breathe out carbon dioxide if we're an animal or human, and a plant simply gives it off back into the atmosphere. There are certain types of plankton that actually get their carbon from the water, which seems a little odd because water is H2O and there's no C for carbon in there anywhere. So what happens, and we'll talk about this a little more later, water kind of absorbs carbon. And also some carbon is given off when plants that are in the water do photosynthesis. So there is carbon that is in the water, and certain types of plankton use that carbon to make shells and things of that sort. So, so there are three basic places where organisms get their carbon from: food, atmosphere, or water. So carbon, how does it get into all these places? Well, it enters the environment when organisms die and their bodies begin to decompose. because decomposers begin to break down the body. So because the organism had taken in carbon at some point, either through food or through the atmosphere or through oceans or other water sources, they have carbon in them, and so when they begin to decompose, some of that carbon then gets released either into the soil or back into the atmosphere. Carbon's also found in fossil fuels. So fossil fuels are things like gas and oil and natural gas. And then it's also found in the atmosphere, as we talked about just a few minutes ago. It's mostly in the form of carbon dioxide. There are some other what we call carbon compounds that are in the atmosphere as well, but mostly it's in the form of carbon dioxide, and it gets there mostly from humans and animals who are doing cellular respiration. So they're taking oxygen and sugars and using that, and then when they're done using that, there is the waste product of carbon dioxide, which our bodies have to get rid of. It's not good for us, and so we release that through as humans anyways, and as many animals, by breathing it out. Plants simply release it, as do many bacteria and other single-celled organisms. And then carbon is also used by plants to do photosynthesis, and we talked about this a few minutes ago. So plants take in the carbon dioxide, and that, along with water and the sun's energy, they're able to make sugars and oxygen. They use some of the sugars, they store some of the sugars, but the oxygen, a lot of it gets, they use some of it in their cells, but a lot of it gets released into the atmosphere. Now, carbon dioxide, an important part of the carbon cycle, often gets a bad rap. It's what we call a greenhouse gas. And so when it comes to things like climate change and global warming and those types of terms, carbon dioxide is often kind of made out to be the bad guy. Do keep in mind, while too much carbon dioxide in our atmosphere can be a bad thing, carbon dioxide is completely and utterly necessary. We could not live without it, and part of the reason is because carbon dioxide actually absorbs energy from the sun, which helps to keep Earth warm. So in other words, the carbon dioxide that is in the atmosphere when the sun's rays get past it, it doesn't allow all of the sun's energy to then release back into space. So the sun's radiation energy bounces off Earth, but not all of it bounces back into space. Some of it stays in our atmosphere to keep us warm, and carbon dioxide is one of the gases that helps to make sure that that happens. It also helps to provide protection so that too much of the sun's radiation doesn't make it to Earth's surface. So some of the sun's radiation actually bounces off carbon dioxide molecules before it even gets into gets all the way to Earth. And so if it was not there, again, too much of the sun's radiation would hit Earth's surface, kill us all. And then without the carbon dioxide, also, the other problem would be that all of that radiation that hits the Earth wouldn't stay here. It would bounce immediately back out into outer space, and we would all freeze to death, and this would become an ice planet. So yes, too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere can be an issue, but it is also completely necessary and has a lot of positive jobs that it does for us. Here is a picture or a diagram of the carbon cycle. So let's go ahead, we'll start up here in the atmosphere. So we've got carbon compounds, mostly carbon dioxide, that are found in the atmosphere. Photosynthesis happens with plants that are down here in the ocean. Also happens over here with plants that are on land. So photosynthesis happens, the carbon dioxide is taken in by those plants. It is used by those plants, and then after after the process of photosynthesis, then cellular respiration happens, where the plants and animals that live down there, and the plants and animals that live here on the land, then release carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. And so that is one way that carbon kind of goes back and forth between the water and the atmosphere, and land and the atmosphere. Then you also have animals, both in the water and on land, that decompose. They die. They decompose, and some of their carbon goes down into the soil or down into the ocean sediment. That's known as sedimentation. Some of the carbon, in the form of carbon dioxide, goes back out into the air again, out into the atmosphere. Sometimes when animals die, their bodies, or plants too, they might be all gathered in one spot, and they get covered with soil and things very quickly, and they are under a lot of pressure, and in just the right circumstances, fossil fuels are formed. So gas deposits, natural gas deposits, oil deposits, things of that sort. Coal deposits, sorry, that's also an important one. Coal can be found down in the soil because of the decomposition of animals and plants. And then humans may extract some of those fossil fuels, the coal, the gas, the oil, and they use that in factories and cars and lawn mowers and motorcycles and all kinds of things. And we burn those fossil fuels. That's known as combustion. And carbon dioxide is released back into the atmosphere. So you can see that there are a lot of different parts to the carbon cycle. And hopefully you can also see how completely necessary the carbon cycle is to life here on Earth.